Alright, after Prey, Arc 14, the remaining members were Jack Slash, Bonesaw, and Siberian, with the one new member being Hookwolf. Evidently, given their now low members, some rapid recruitment was in order. So in the following time after their Brockton visit, they, at various other locations, ended up recruiting Damsel of Distress, Skinslip, and Night Hag. There were two others, but they were unnamed and died with no fanfare. So, to begin, the one that we have by far the most information on, for various reasons, was Damsel of Distress. She was a mover, shaker, and blaster. A mover and nuker, to use that outdated term again. Granted, I use that while not being that sure about how much she actually qualified as a nuker. Nevertheless, similar to Burnscar in the last video, I'm going to do something I tend to not do again and talk about a character's mental state. As it concerns Damsel, the latter was even more relevant than it was for Burnscar. Now, why is that? Well, first, to bring it up early, the central weakness she had for most of her time as a parahuman was her inability to control her power, with said inability stemming from her shard's somewhat vague desire for Damsel to always be quote-unquote top dog. When she was top dog, her power was more controllable, easier to use, and more generally, she just had a better time with it. On the opposite side of that, as you've likely rightly assumed already, when she failed to be the dominant one in whatever parahuman ecosystem she found herself in, her power became unruly. Unruly in the sense that her power would randomly become active and cause issues for her, which, funny enough, made her power even more uncontrollable because her other related weakness was how the more stressed she was, the less control she had. As one can imagine, that perpetuated a cycle where she would become anxious of her power flaring up, which made her even more stressed, which made her power fritz out more, etc., etc. In fact, that continual stream of embarrassment and frustration she experienced because of her lack of control could at times cause her to forego sleep, eating, and even dressing properly. It is quite an interesting spiral. She would rather be deprived of sleep and starve and look like a mess of a human over experiencing her power potentially activating while she was in the middle of doing a given mundane and everyday activity. I've gotten a bit sidetracked, but that sum of information, while still very important to know, is also a long-winded way to say that while they may have existed before she got powers, Damsel's shard intensified and helped develop many, let's say, counterproductive personality quirks. Chief among them was her immense megalomania. That made her obsessive, stubborn, narcissistic, very prideful, and perhaps a tad too ambitious. That said, none of that was necessarily a detriment to her. After all, the other Slaughterhouse members had those traits to varying degrees too. However, what was certainly unbeneficial was how those traits paired with the following compulsions. First, when she was not the dominant parahuman in her area, she would progressively get more and more reckless, and that would eventually cause her to act out and try to become number one, typically in a fairly, reckless and ill-planned manner. As for the second one, that was perhaps the more concerning one because while the first got her into trouble, her need to quote-unquote grind her enemies down hampered her ability to get out of said trouble, and more broadly lowered her chances of winning fights. As you may be wondering, how bad was it really? Well, even when on the cusp of victory, or something else along those lines, her shard motivated her to monologue, mock, and taunt her enemy, to the point that she's been described as a borderline campy cartoon villain. Evidently, while she did said camp routine, her foes got a notable sum of time to get back on their feet and or formulate a plan. Note that this desire to lord over her nearly defeated or temporarily disadvantaged enemy was not something she could simply ignore, at least with the state of mind she was typically in. You see, at all times, her power exerted a sort of pressure on her. One, as I've said several times before, that always pushed her to become number one. When she monologues, it isn't just a way to satisfy her megalomania, it was also, more or less, the only time she could relieve herself of that aforementioned pressure. During those times, even if she consciously or subconsciously knew that she probably shouldn't be doing it, the drug-like relief she felt was more than enough incentive to do something so counterproductive. At least for a time, but more on that later. Alright, with all that done, let's finally get to her power. A bit more delayed than usual, but oh well. Now, simply put, she could radiate out shotgun-like bursts of warped space-time out of her hands. There were several ways said warping was described, but the more expected ones related to its more surface-level destructive capabilities. How it could disintegrate virtually anything. How it sheared and created storms of uneven gravity. How it tore living things into pieces, and how it could alternatively distort inorganic material. However, what I found to be of greater interest was how her power apparently related to the passage and halting of time. Which, fair enough, doesn't really mean much on its own, but things do get clearer when you look past the plain destruction and factor in finer details, such as how it could cause things to swell and burst into nothingness, and how it generally made things wither and decay, as in, for example, making paint peel off surfaces faster, or making wood fade and splinter. I could list more, but you get the idea. Her power made things advance. So, earlier, like just a little bit ago, I noted how her power distorted inorganic material. While that was probably a passive thing her ability did, she could somewhat actively direct that distortion too. Specifically, through the warping of space-time, she was described as condensing already dense material into some sort of black matter. She couldn't make particularly intricate or complicated things, but she was noted to have been carrying around crude knives and stakes, among other knickknacks, in a bag. That said, she does have things on her that likely required a tad bit more, let's say, finesse, such as a looped wire belt and a mask made from a part of an engine block. Though it's worth keeping in mind that the mask came about from her failing to erase what I assume to be a full engine block. The latter attempt resulting in said engine block only looking slightly warped and kicked around. Now, I couldn't personally verify it, perhaps because I was too tunnel visioned to see what was right in front of me, but I did read something about Damsel's condensed black material being power resistant in some way. Take that as you will, it's probably a me thing, but at the same time, this isn't the first time the worm Wikipedia had information I could not find, or had information that inflated the capabilities of a power based on vague and or short descriptions. Even by my standards of making assumptions, there were times where a lot was inferred from shockingly little usable information. Don't even get me started on the times the wrong place was sourced for the given thing that was stated, or the times they just don't source something I feel should be sourced. But who am I to criticize? I stopped sourcing a while ago. I found myself running out of description box space. Plus, to be fair, I do pretty consistently mention how bad of a researcher I am. Anyway, forgive whatever that was. On to the parameters, details, whatever I decide to name this section this time. First of all, when compared to other space-time powers that I've talked about, Damsel's had around the same raw penetrative power as Scrub's, but was most definitely not as potent as Foil's. Second, while I'm not too clear about how wide it was specifically, her bursts were of a cone shape. Additionally, said shape was described as radiating out in every direction, except directly at her. So one can imagine that it was a fairly wide cone of effect, at least most of the time. Third, her range fluctuated, so it's a little iffy to state what her true range was. That said, I'll nevertheless note that on the lower end, her range was 4 to 6 feet, or around 1 to 2 meters. On the higher end, it was around 10 to 15 feet, or around 3 to 4.6 meters. I'd hazard a guess and assume the higher range was after Bonesaw did some tinkering on her, but truthfully, given all the variables that could influence Damsel's power, I can't confidently state how true or not that assumption may be. What can be said is that before Bonesaw, Damsel did seem to have a more consistent problem of missing with her power, or more specifically, failing to hit the particular person or thing she wanted to hit. The funny thing about that was how all she really needed to better focus and direct her power was some quote-unquote special gloves. And by special, I mean something as simple as a pair of fingerless gloves. However, to be fair, there was little information for that detail, so there is certainly the possibility of there being various quirks and whatnot that made something so seemingly simple not simple. More so, it's not like Damsel had any reason to think an ordinary pair of fingerless gloves would do anything. Plus, powers can be quite peculiar, but they can be very straightforward too, so I'll leave it up to you to decide how special the gloves actually needed to be. Oh, and as a final thing for this part, her mover aspect was a weak one, relatively speaking, and it came from her using the recoil from her power to move or dodge around. The one really concrete thing I found about the strength of said recoil was that it could propel her between 10 to 15 feet, around 3 to 4.6 meters. As stated previously, Damsel's control over her power was poor. However, between the noted fingerless gloves and the various bits of other information I've given, she was not completely hopeless. For example, she did know some things about how her power could activate. First, she knew that any number of finger and hand movements could set it off, with many of said movements, unfortunately for her, being common ones that most people would just unconsciously do in their day-to-day. Second, she knew how much force, how much pressure she put behind an action could incite activation too. Third, in light of point 1 and 2, she found that if she slowly moved her hands and fingers, her power seemingly had less of a chance of accidentally causing issues. Fourth, she discovered through testing that the specific way she moved her hands and fingers didn't really matter. Even if she replicated a specific gesture or configured her hands in the same way as she did in a previous attempt, the resulting blast would not be the same. However, that said, she did discover that certain more non-specific, let's say, movements did seem to modify broader aspects of her power. One example was how an open, moving hand would generally cause her power to splash out more. It would have a wider area of effect, but less range. Another example was if she pressed her hands together, then pushed out with both, the following blast would be more concentrated and consistent. Note that I can only assume that the increased concentration meant that it hit harder. Also note that I don't really know what being more consistent in this context means. I want to say it made the wideness of her cone less random, but I have zero evidence for that, though it does sound believable enough to be true. Regardless, unrelated to all that, just to help you visualize it, her power was described to look like darkness, shadow, distorted space, and visual static. Cool. To be quick with this segment, as earlier noted, though not explicitly, her protective mantin effect was that it would not directly hurt her. Sure, she could potentially injure herself with the recoil, and sure, the accidental activations could potentially harm her too, depending on what she was doing and where she was, but the blast itself would not blast back at her. However, that did not mean that her power didn't more innocuously affect her. For one, the first time she used her power, it turned her hair white. Second, her power did blast away things on her, such as sweat, dirt, lint, dust, and yes, even clothes. Finally, to refer back to the hair, even if she dyed her hair, continual use of her ability would eventually purge her hair of the dye too. Fun stuff. We're in the home stretch now, so let's get Damsel done. Now, I have mentioned a few times that Bonesaw did something to her. Suffice to say, it was through Bonesaw that Damsel got control over her power. Though, since it was Bonesaw, it wasn't a simple given gift. First, she broke Damsel's pride, and in turn, Damsel became much more cold, ruthless, and detached. Second, she removed Damsel's voice, and that, along with the latter, got rid of most of her compulsion to monologue and such. Third, Damsel herself was modified. Her arms became twice as long, and her flesh was stretched over several feet of new, elongated, and partially mechanical blade-tipped fingers. I'll mention that it was at this point where I think her default range, without any additional effort from her, was expanded. This is where I believe she got that upper 15 feet or 4.6 meters range. Though, from what I could tell, her range could still go as low as 6 feet. Around 1.8 meters. Finally, fourth, because of her new arms, she became better able to manage the recoil of her power. She could more easily focus and direct it to propel her where she wanted to be, and she could generally also better control the strength of the blasts themselves. Keep in mind that I don't know if those earlier details I gave about her mover classification referred to Damsel specifically before or after Bonesaw. Personally, given how much trouble she did have with her power before the modifications, those earlier numbers I gave for the recoil movement probably came from the Bonesaw stuff. Though, while on the topic, I can see it applying to pre- and post-Bonesaw Damsel, with the key difference between pre- and post being how much more unreliable and inconsistent her movements likely were without the new arms and hands. Next up, how about a quick one? Skinslip was a changer and a brute, and he had the ability to manipulate his skin. However, what was considered his skin was rather lax. As such, he would flay people and crudely stitch, or staple on, the flayed skin onto himself. His power would assist in the process by regenerating him and connecting the new tissue onto him in a more solid manner. Subsequently, with said additions, the scope, reach, and capabilities of his power would expand. Keep in mind that he could still experience tissue rejection and decay, so from time to time he will be forced to gather more skin, presumably only from humans, because if tissue from the latter can be rejected, I imagine animal skin isn't much of an option for him. Granted, I recall pig skin being used for skin grafts in the past, so maybe some animal skins can be used, albeit probably with inferior benefits. Nevertheless, nothing much else to say, so here are some of the things he could do with his skin. He could climb various surfaces, form grappling hooks, smother and bludgeon people, and apparently break any fall. Also, while not blatantly stated, it's sensible to assume that what he could do depended heavily on how much skin he had available to use. More so, I imagine the quality or origin of the skin could influence matters too. That said, without knowing other things such as how much total skin he could attach to himself, or how capable he was with just his own natural skin, or much of any of the other properties of his power, it's difficult to assume anything with so little. Who knows, maybe Skinslip was like Skidmark or Parian, where their true capabilities were just unknown, at least for a while. Alright, while not as much info as Damsel, I think, we do know a fair bit about Night Hag too. She was a breaker and a shaker, and what's different about her compared to most other breakers was that she stayed in her breaker form permanently, which, among other things, made her a Noctis cape, a parahuman that needed less to no sleep and or food. For her, from what I could tell, it was no sleep and food. Staying in her breaker form also made her connection with her shard stronger. Lovely. There were two aspects to her power. The first was how it would transmute the environment around her into a special material. For her to transmute and infect her surroundings, she had to stay still, and the longer she stayed still, the more the infection would spread. Note that this infection area was not permanent. it would slowly go away without Night Hag there. Additionally, its reach was shallow. The infection did not penetrate much past the top surface layers of her environment. As for the total range, how much this infection could spread is difficult to pin down. While there was an instance where we know that it spread in a 15 feet / 4.57 meters radius around her, given her strategy of using her infection to cut off points of retreat, that would not make too much sense as a max range, since all things considered, 15 feet isn't that big of a radius, at least in more open spaces. It is fair enough that in more enclosed spaces, that said 30 feet total diameter is more effective. Granted, I imagine it's probably a case where she, let's say, theoretically has infinite range or infinite spread, but she would need to stay in place for a very long time. The second part of her power was that if she was killed within her infected area, she could come back. Specifically, upon death, she would shatter into thousands of black shards and reform nearby. Bear in mind that this did not make her immortal. Granted, in the example I'm thinking of where she did die, it was Contessa and Numberman that killed her, and those two aren't exactly your typical parahumans. Now, while not explicitly stated, it's likely she died because she ran out of infected material to use to reform from. The only evidence I have of this was how after she died, one time a park bench got reconfigured and distorted, and another time there was a bare patch of grass left behind. All that said, it is probably easier said than done for most people. After all, besides it being, like I said, Contessa and Numberman working together to kill Night Hag, they were specifically killing 4 Night Hag clones sharing the same general infected area. They were also killing said clones in rapid succession. So now that I think about it, maybe that's another aspect to think about. Maybe if you kill her fast enough, her ability to come back just can't keep up or something. So yeah. I suppose another thing to consider was how Night Hag seemed able to manipulate that infected area too. Enough that she had a MO of breaking and maiming people, starting from the limbs, then working her way to the more vital parts. Though, now that I think about it, that MO doesn't really imply anything besides her being, sadistic. Unless I missed it, just because she had to stay still for her power to grow does not mean that she had to stay still, all the time. So in all likelihood, she probably just, walked to the person and did her, terrible deeds to them. That said, that brings into question on how she subdued them. But like I said earlier, that may be just me missing information again, so yeah. That's all for the power itself, but to talk more about her breaker situation, besides the whole Noctis thing, if she wanted to, she can turn back to normal by drawing all of the infected material into herself. However, that's not a good idea, because extended time within one's breaker form can lead to several consequences. In Night Hag's case, while we never knew what it was, her extended stay did accrue some sort of ever more serious penalty that would hit her in the event of her exiting her breaker form. Now, don't you worry, being in that other form for so long had its own issues too, but first, note that breakers in general already had a naturally stronger connection with their shard, so while there may be benefits to, as stated earlier, having an even stronger connection from always using her power, she had the predicament of losing herself, of having her shard have much more influence on her, to the point of potential ego death. It could be temporary, or it could be permanent. It could happen in an instant, or it may be a slower process of her progressively losing more and more parts of herself. She may become nothing more than a body for her shard to puppet, for lack of better word. Though, while that may scare most other breakers from abusing their powers, Night Hag evidently did not like her normal self for whatever reason. So even if you could theoretically go back to the beginning of her parahuman career and told her the consequences of what she was committing to, I feel she'd probably not care. Well, that's that. What I could say here, I've already said way too many times in one way or another in other videos, or within a post, or within the description of a video. In fact, maybe I will add extra thoughts and comments in this video's description. I don't know. I haven't gotten there yet. I guess one thing I can say is that as far as I am currently aware, I have one more, I think, short video about the Slaughterhouse 9 to go. The hybrid clones of the colloquially named Slaughterhouse 9000. Perhaps I'll get that done in a timely manner. I probably won't. I am extremely unproductive and get too caught up in my own thoughts and in other activities. Like I've mentioned in the past, I really am kind of just making a slideshow presentation with a few extra steps. Anyway, yeah, take care. Until next time. And the last time for these series of videos. I really wonder what I'll do next after the 9. Yeah. Like and subscribe, I guess. Bye.